So today's topic is evil. Um, Simply put, what is evil? When we're talking about evil, what do we mean? Something that is immoral or seen as bad. What else do we have?
It's like taking pleasure in someone else's like I don't know.
Yeah, it's
like someone else's that what's the word I'm looking for? Like someone else feeling bad, someone else is suffering. Someone else is
someone
suffering.
else's suffering probably works. It is something that is to the core wrong or bad. Pleasure in others' suffering. So in a certain sense, causing someone suffering knowingly is another issue. An emotional expression of dislike or disapproval. So there's this other element which is just we call things dislike or disapproval. So these are the sorts of things that we have in mind when we're talking about evil. This one I'm going to star Holland's because it's a slightly different view on evil. But everyone else's is something immoral, something bad, something that, this is a really nice one, to the core is wrong or bad. Act of doing something wrong and causing harm to others. And I think what all of you are doing a really nice job of capturing here is that there's this moral or wrong element. And so there are other things that cause suffering to other people, but they aren't, in a certain sense, evil. So what are some things that cause suffering, but we don't think are evil? Lino just brought up a intentional. So for instance, why isn't, disease, that's a good one. Disease. Why do we not say that disease is evil? No one's out there when people say that COVID is evil, if someone says that, they mean it in a very different way from the way in which, I don't know, give me an example of something that is evil, just so we can, or agreed upon as evil, or you think is evil. Murder. Okay, disease, what's the difference between murder and disease?
Disease is a circumstance and murder is a behavior.
Yeah, murder is a behavior. It's intentional. Someone is trying to do it. Rape is another thing that is evil. Rape. Kim Jong-un. Versus, what are some other things that cause harm but we don't think are evil? Holland asks, there's another question which is acts versus people. And this is something I actually want to talk about. Evil acts versus evil people. So the first thing I want to say, no worries, Holland. I assume it for some reason, I don't understand why the chat does this. And I guess it wants to protect privacy. If you send one thing private, then it auto sends everything else private. So we'll come back to this question because this is something I really want to highlight, is this evil acts versus evil people thing. But what are some other things that are bad but not evil? We've got disease.
Probably telling people the truth.
So you can, let's see, hurtful truths. Like telling someone you failed your class. Money, you could say in some sense, can cause pain and suffering. Mo money, mo problems. It can cause pain and suffering, but we don't think of money as evil. So does everyone understand this core difference here of evil things versus not evil things? So why do we think, or why do we talk about evil? Why do we draw this divide here between evil things that cause harm and not evil things that cause harm? Stealing, I think, actually could, in certain senses, be evil and in other senses not be evil, depending on the circumstance. But why do we bother drawing this? Why don't we just say, like, bad shit happens, end of story? What is it about evil that captivates us?
I think it's just our need to categorize things.
Yeah, so it's a need to categorize things, But why not just categorize things in terms of good and bad? What does talking about things in terms of evil get us? So part of it is, all right, so I'm going to erase these up here. These are just the general definitions. And then we've got a couple things in the chat that I definitely want to highlight. We've got one from Raven is there's this extreme to it. Things that are evil are extreme and unusual. So there's this sense in which like things like disease or things like hurricanes or bad weather or heart attacks, they happen a lot. So evil things seem to stand out. They stand out more. And another thing, as Holland says, we tend to talk about evil because there's this assigning of responsibility or blame. When someone is evil, what do we say should be done to them? Or if an action is evil, what response should we have?
Death penalty.
There's a penalty here. So for instance, if I knowingly penalty/punishment, if I were to find someone, bring them into my apartment and kill them violently, versus if I were sleepwalking and accidentally, like completely out of my mind, picked up a knife, walked outside the apartment and just stabbed someone while I was sleeping. What is the fundamental difference here? Is one of these things evil and is the other one not? Are they both evil? What are people's thoughts about this sort of thing?
Well, I know there's like ethics, right? There's consequentialism and deontology. And deontology is basically when you had the wrong intentions behind the action, and consequentialism is when whatever consequences, whatever happens, ends up being evil, right? So I guess you could say with the sleepwalking, the behavior was evil, and then if the person, let's say, did a premeditated murder, from the deontological perspective, it would be that that person is evil.
Versus, and this is a good place to bring up evil behavior versus evil person. So when we're talking about a, well, first off, what is the relationship between these two things? What is the relationship between an evil person and an evil behavior? Can an evil person, well, straightforwardly, I think we think evil people do evil behaviors, but can an evil person do non-evil behaviors?
Yeah.
It seems like they can. Like even the most evil person probably just, ties their shoes in a non-evil way. What about, can the ordinary person do evil behavior?
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like also we can think of cases in which like murder, like if somebody gets you really, really mad, a crime of passion, most of the murders that take place are somebody gets really angry and kills a loved one. And even if that was a normal person, we typically want to draw this divide and say there can be evil behaviors by normal people, but there are also evil people. So what is it about a person that makes them an evil person as opposed to just a person who happens to do an evil behavior?
Their morals and their overall intentions.
So intentions and morality. So when we talk about their morals or their overall intentions, what do we mean here? Yeah, we've got Cassidy says consistently does evil things. Where it seems like when we're talking about an evil person, we're talking about somebody who consistently does evil things. And much of the time we like to think, so yeah, antisocial values. So they've got values that do not value other people. So for instance, there's somebody who wants to, all they care about is themselves and don't worry about the well-being of others in society. Holland just brought up another great point. You can also talk about justice. Retributive justice stems from belief that there's a balance that needs to be set right via punishment. So another element of our like very legal system or our punishment system or the very idea of prison is that if an action gets committed, then the person who does that action, there should be an equal and opposite reaction in response, an eye for an eye sort of thing. So if you commit murder, why do you go to jail? Well, part of it is, generally speaking, well, there's usually three components. What are generally the three reasons that people give to send someone to jail? Like, what is the reason that we think jail should exist?
To protect society.
So one is to protect society, where in a certain sense, these people are dangerous. Therefore, we want to put them away, because if they're in there, they're not our problem. Morris Holland says to appease society. If somebody does something negative, we want them to, in some sense, go away. Also, to give closure to the victims. In the same sort of way, it's a matter of the people on the outside wanting reward. Or not reward, but getting something in response. It's like an equal and opposite. Gray says, and the second reason that we often have this is rehabilitation. The idea is that this person did wrong, but while going to prison, we can teach them the wrongness of their ways. So this is, at least in theory, one of the reasons. But as Holland says, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that prisons as they exist are not really that high in rehabilitation. So we've got this put over there to not deal with. So we've got the rehabilitate. And then the third one, which is the one I'm going to star, is this sense of retribution or punishment. And you can think about the way in which a prison is set up, so I think Lena brings up deterrence, which I think deterrence is kind of tied in with the punishment element. The idea is if you know you're going to get punished, you're not going to do something wrong or evil, or at the very least, you're going to be less likely. But you can see just the nature of a prison is in some sense geared around this idea of the people in the prison did something wrong or bad. Because if all we wanted was to keep society safe, and all we wanted was anyone who committed murder to just be kept away, we could design prisons in ways that were not as punitive. Also, if we were really interested in habilitation to this, like only about that, prisons would look a lot different than they do. So there's this element in which it's not just any one of these three factors. Rather, this notion of punishment, this notion of retribution or retributive justice kind of mixes with the rehabilitation. Like there are genuine attempts to rehabilitate people in prison. There is definitely a punitive element. And also there is just an element of separate the rest of society from the people who have done something wrong. So going back to the evil person versus evil behavior, generally speaking, do we think that most evil behaviors are committed by evil people, or are most evil behaviors committed by normal people?
I guess speaking to your point and like back to the prison thing, wouldn't there also be systemic evil, right? So certain laws or protocols, like in the prison system, with regards to like solitary confinement being considered torture, all of the capital punishment, etc., right? That isn't really an action, but it's a certain written piece of information that sort of, there's no intent behind it, right? There's a just intent, but it's not executed in a moral way.
Yeah, so this is another good thing to bring up, is these systemic evils, where they're just systems that cause evil in ways, or things that we talk about as evil, pain to people, and yet it's not really that anyone is attempting to cause the harm, or that behavior, there's any particular behavior that you can point to and say it's an evil behavior by itself. It's rather that just the entire system of ordinary behaviors creates evil. Now, why am I talking about all this evil stuff? And just big picture, what are all the things we talk about with evil? So on the one hand, and as Stephanie and Primo said, we have this notion in which most, like a lot of us in some sense, think of evil as something that comes, and a lot of times, from normal people doing evil. And yet we also seem to have this assumption that if a normal person does evil, then you can ask yourself, why are we sending this person to jail in the first place? If really it's just normal people who sometimes do evil things, why are we treating them like evil people? And it seems like very often, while we have this sense that normal people can do evil things, we generally have this understanding of whatever it is, whenever an evil action is done, maybe it's a normal person, but maybe that normal person has an evil inside part. Or very often the most evil things are done by people that are just evil to the core. I mean, think about movies. It's never just like the super villain is never somebody who just like is having a bad day. It's rather they generally have some overarching goal of world conquest or universe conquest. And so what they end up doing is like we have this idea of this evil sort of villain that is responsible for it. Alan says, like Charles Manson versus the bankers who caused the 2008 financial crash. And so that's one we can come back to later in class, because there's a way in which our notions of evil, as we typically think of it, we picture someone like Charles Manson, but in truth, he caused significantly less damage to people than bankers who took risky bets with other people's money. So what I'm going to try to do is our typical everyday view of evil. We have this somewhat nuanced view where normal people can do evil things, but very often we generally seem to assume that at the core, evil actions come from evil insides. It's something about a person on the inside. Maybe it's they're in a bad mood at that moment. Maybe it's that something has set them off. Maybe it's that evil, like maybe they're not always evil, but they get evil around certain things. Like maybe they have a temper. And so even if they're not like generally a bad person, sometimes this temper comes out. And so this is kind of, does this sound like our general idea of what evil is? And if you look at the movies, it's always like the villain is pretty clearly the villain. Or at least in most movies. Does this sound generally like our concept of evil? All right. And I do want to say that there are some sorts of views. So I think it was Holland brought up this one over, where was it? I erased it. It was the thing we call things we dislike evil. So there is this other strand. So just to take a little side note, there is this view, and I feel like it's usually in they put in the villain's mouth in any movie or TV show, and they say things like there's no such thing as evil. All there is like disagreements and which side of the fence you're standing on. And it's also it's sometimes this notion of motivism. So this is, to give it a more philosophical sort of view, emotivism is a view within ethics, or specifically within meta-ethics. Then when you say something's evil, all you mean is that you don't like it. And there's nothing to evil over and above that we don't like it. And most of the time, however, most people don't approach the world with this view of what evil is. Most of us think there is like a good and a bad, a good and an evil. And the evil things are done for a reason, and it's done for an evil reason, or there's something at the core inside a person. Maybe it's just a momentary lapse. Maybe it's that this person is a really an evil to the core, universal evil dictator. But the idea is generally we don't just think that we're saying something's evil when we don't like it. That's a view within meta-ethics, which I think is a really interesting view that kind of challenges this conventional wisdom that evil is something inside a person, or a way of characterizing a behavior that comes from an evil place. And usually with the intention around a behavior, for a behavior to be evil, we usually have to think that this person knows in some way that they are doing something to cause harm. We very rarely want to say a behavior is evil if the person doesn't know there's any harm being caused. If like you think that what you're doing is like just pressing the button to turn on the lights, and instead you launch a nuclear weapon, you're dumb, but it doesn't seem evil. If, however, you know that somebody's going to get harmed. That's a key part of this evil behavior. So does this all sound all right? Now, why am I bringing this up in a philosophy and psychology class? Why are we talking about evil? Yeah, so Holland says, unless it's the consequentialist view, yes. But I think even most consequentialists generally want to say that there is a certain level of intentionality that has to go with your actions for it to count as, like, there has to be some, like, generally speaking, if you do something by complete accident, even the strongest utilitarian doesn't want to say that you are doing an evil thing. Like, for instance, if I happen to raise my arm in such a way, yeah, a rule utilitarian, I guess, would, because for those of you who aren't following along with this meta-ethical discussion right now, don't worry about it. This is kind of like a side discussion for those of you who have taken some ethics classes. I guess a rule utilitarian would say that, give me a second. I mean, an act utilitarian, you wouldn't, a rule utilitarian, would you have to have any intention to cause? Yeah, I guess a rule utilitarian, you wouldn't have to have any intention to cause the harm if you accepted the rule and that rule led to more pain. Then it could be evil without being intentional. But an act utilitarian wouldn't want to say, but yeah, there are very few rule utilitarians. All right, back on this. So why am I bringing up this discussion of evil in a philosophy and psychology class? So one of the things we want to talk about is, let's look at the mental conditions that develop to help create the behaviors that we deem evil. And especially why I want to talk about it in this psychology class is that a lot of the literature from psychology suggests a picture of evil that is very different from the picture that we have in our everyday common sense view. So, in our everyday common sense view, where is it that evil comes from? So if I murder someone, what are the explanations we typically give for this sort of thing? Also, did I just get blurry? If so, I'll shut off the camera and turn it back on.
Yeah, slightly.
Yeah, give me a sec. Stop.
Oh, it's better now.
Oh, it's better. What about when I, okay, perfect. All right, so say I murder someone. What are the explanations we would give for my murdering someone? I'll draw me murdering someone. So fear. So there's an emotion right now, fear in my head. What else? Yeah, sometimes it's premeditation or moments of anger. But if I say it comes from premeditation, so let's go with a premeditated murder. I pick out someone, I want to kill them. We talk about adrenaline in the moment. So there's these momentary sorts of things. But we often start to look at predispositions. So when we're looking at my predispositions to have aggressive or angry behavior, what sorts of things where do we give explanations for this? Where do we look to give explanations for these things?
At a patient's history?
Yeah, we generally look at their life history. We generally look at the other one, our genetics. And we very often look at personality. So generally we think of personality as kind of this combination of genetics or nature plus our life history or nurture. Another thing we can look at is environmental stress, very often at earlier times in our development. Like, what did we develop in ways that made it difficult for us to handle emotional situations? What are the immediate environmental situations that cause us to feel this sort of stress? And what we're kind of showing here is, even in a case in which we say, like, we have a straightforward case, I could be a pretty normal person with just some, some anger issues, or I got pushed to a breaking point because of other things. There's generally still this assumption that it's personality, or there's a genetic component, or there's a life history component very often with life history components. Those of you who have ever seen anything about any TV show or movie about somebody who ends up being a serial killer, what is always the case that we find out at some point during the movie or the show?
They used to harm.
Say that again, Alan.
They used to harm animals or something.
Yeah, usually it's they used to harm animals, and also there's almost always a bad childhood, issues with their parents, and very often some type of abuse. So in all these sorts of cases, we are looking at personality, genetics, life history, and there's definitely a component of this in evil behaviors. It looks like if people have predispositions in these sorts of things, we can look back at life history, genetics, personality, and very often we assume that if somebody does something evil, there's something about their history responsible for it. And there's something that makes them special or different from the average person. So even if normal people do commit the majority of evil actions, we're still kind of assuming that even that normal person has something about them that led to it. And in the extreme cases, somebody who murders tons of people or somebody who tortures people, we generally assume there's something wrong with them. It's something internal. However, within psychology, especially within the last, 60 years, there's been all this new studying suggesting that maybe it's not that the majority of evil is not coming from personality. It's not coming from genetics. It's not coming from life history. It's rather that each and every one of us has the potential to be evil. In evil, not in the sense of like we have a moment of doing something wrong, but rather that if you put any human being in the correct circumstances, a normal person, and not normal with these life histories, like you have been brought up in the right sort of situation to commit or do things that from the outside are going to be called evil. Holland's one argument, if behaviors and mental states are caused by genetics and environmental facts which are neutral, there can't be something inherently evil that results. So evil may be an expression of our attitude. So yes, one of the big things is this notion of evil assumes a level of free will. And if we find out that we don't have, and do people know what I mean by free will here? Like you have the power over your own decisions. It's not like it's the difference between being held at gunpoint and being told do this versus it's really within your control. So if we look around and we start to find that genetics, personalities, life history things are what cause us to be this way, or what we're going to talk about shortly, situations, then maybe all that's left for evil to pick out are our emotional views. So that's the emotivism component here. But how many of you think of yourself as evil? All right. So good. None of you are like trying to become evil supervillains. So that's a good start. How many of you think that you would, you're not getting paid for it, there's no punishment if you wouldn't do it, would shock a complete stranger with electrical voltage that might kill them? How many people think they would do this? How many people think that their classmates would do this? So maybe, but if we were to guess, what percentage of the population would choose to cause an electric shock of a killing variety to other people, even if they're getting no benefit from it and there's no punishment for not doing it? Yeah. So here's the thing. So those of you who have taken psychology classes are giving the right answers. If you're in the right circumstances, a really high percentage. And what are those right circumstances? Well, we're going to start with the Milgram experiments. So how many people are familiar enough with the Milgram experiments to explain them so that I can take a sip of water and give my mouth and throat a break? Anybody? Anyone confident in their Milgram experiment?
I'll
Great.
try. They took like normal people, normal college students like us, and basically made them believe that they were shocking people when they actually weren't. They were fake participants, well, disguised participants. And they found that majority of them actually were obedient in shocking them and increasingly shocking the amount of voltage.
Yeah, so that's the general experimental design, is you basically, in the right circumstance, you will do what you think is causing immense pain to someone in an experimental setting. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'm sure there's somebody, so I'm just going to describe it in like the minute detail, just because it's one of the most fascinating and screwed up experiments ever conducted. Well, at least within the United States. I'm not going to count like.
But what was it over than 50% people who just made the damage for other people? I heard about this experiment, but I didn't think that like there are more than like 10% of.
So here's how it worked. It was 67% went all the way. So that's the numbers. So the way the experiment works is you find an ad in the newspaper that says, hey, experimental subjects looking for a study on learning. You get there and they say, here's the experiment. We've done a lot of tests on rats to test whether punishment and reward on rats facilitates learning. We haven't done many experiments on humans, so we're going to study humans now. You two people here, you, who are the subject, and this other person who you think is a subject but is really an actor, you two are going to be our teacher and our student. One of you is going to have to memorize a list of things and then recite them back to the teacher, and the teacher will check your answers, and if you get it wrong, we'll give you a little electric shock. Now, this electric shock will gradually increase. So at first, here, we'll let you feel it, and they give you like a very low electric shock, and it's basically just like a mildly unpleasant sensation, but it's not going to hurt you. And so you've got all these buttons, and the first one is low, and then it continues all the way up, and the last one just says something like danger, high voltage. So they said, all right, now we're going to randomly decide who's this. You, and they point at you, who's the experiment, the person who's actually the experiment is getting conducted on. You're going to be the teacher, and you, other person, going into the other room. You're not going to be able to be seen by the person who's giving the test, but they are going to be on the other side, and they can hear you, you can hear each other, and they will give you the shocks if you get it wrong. Now, experiment starts, they start getting it wrong. So you have to start, you press the low button, you hear them from the other side of the wall go, eh. Then you keep going, they keep making mistakes. By about halfway, they start going, ow, oh, fuck, that hurts. Then you get to about this point, and there's like, oh my God, please, please stop, please stop. You get to the end, and they've just gone completely silent. There's no more noise coming from the other side of the wall. If at any point in the experiment you go, I'm not so sure about this, there will be somebody standing next to you in a lab coat who will just say things like, I'm sorry, the experiment must continue, or you agreed and we really need your data. These people were not being paid, and they were not doing this for credit. It was completely volunteer. Now, what percentage of people stopped at some point and said, this is screwed up, I'm not doing any more? 33%. And yes, Holland says, I feel like this experiment was super unethical. And the fact of the matter is, this experiment, I think it was done in either the 60s or the 70s, and it would never get by an ethics board today. Like, there's no way the people who engaged in this experiment were genuinely concerned. Like, they had what was like low-grade PTSD from participating in the experiment, because when it ended, these people, many of them genuinely thought they had killed someone, when in truth, it was just an actor on the other side of the wall. But really, and very often, like, you had normal people, and what would happen is the people conducting the experiment would almost like freeze up, and they were like, palms were sweaty. They just didn't know what to do. And yeah, so exactly, there's a question of whether they actually gave consent because the experimenter was pressuring them, of whether they gave consent to, did they give informed consent? And I think these days the answer of the the ethics board of psychology would find that no, these people did not give consent to participate in this experiment. And yet we nonetheless have this fascinating data. So the fact of the matter was 67% of people were willing to go all the way in this ordinary experimental situation. Now, what, of course, does this sort of experiment make you think of? What sorts of events in history, events in your own life, does this look a lot similar to? Somebody in a position of power, yeah, it looks a lot like any sort of mass execution, where you have a normal person who's being told to do something simply because this person they agreed to do it. They don't know the person on the other side of the wall. It's just they are told by somebody else to do it. And that person is probably being told by somebody else, make sure the experiment runs well. Who's being told by somebody up the line, like, this is our most important thing. And so how you can see is, yeah, part of the reason this experiment was conducted was basically everything about German history suggested that there was nothing intrinsic to German citizens that made them especially prone to murdering millions. And then there was this question of, all right, so if there were millions of Jewish people and other individuals who were murdered in the Holocaust, and the vast majority of these killings were carried out by ordinary Germans, why on earth was this the case? What was it that led to ordinary people doing these truly evil actions? Because if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that the Holocaust was one of the highest pinnacles of evil in human history. So how did we get normal, ordinary people doing this level of evil? And it looks like what this is suggesting is it's not personal history. It's not something about like prone to violence. All it takes is to put somebody in a circumstance in which you are being told you must continue. So I think there is an element here for certain people of a power trip. But I think there's another side where, like, when we think about a power trip, we think of it as the person is actively gaining some enjoyment out of it or some positivity of shocking people. But I think there's another question, which is there's another element, though, which is much less forceful, where it's just like we do it because someone told us not to, and we have this intrinsic fear of disobedience, where it's just if somebody in a position of power says do it, we're almost psychologically programmed to do what they tell us to do. And yeah, so the Eichmann trial in Hannah Arendt's discussion of the banality of evil, and this is really what I'm talking about here. What we find in this case is the evil being conducted in these cases are not being conducted by people who are trying to cause harm. They are doing it because this is what they were told to do. Now you can imagine if this was your job, how much more you'd be likely to go along with it. If your job was to, you were a civil servant and all of a sudden you get transferred and your job is you are now in charge of, instead of, doing the paperwork at the DMV, you're now doing the paperwork at the concentration camp. If you just say, no, I'm not going to do that, there's now added pressures that aren't even there in this experiment. So in an experiment like this, there was literally no punishment for just getting up and walking away other than your internal feeling of I should continue. If your job is on the line, where you agreed originally, like, yes, I push papers at the DMV, now all of a sudden, you're pushing papers at the concentration camp. And so along the way, if somebody's saying, no, you got to keep going, plus you're going to lose your job, you can see how even the most ordinary person who's not getting a power trip out of this is engaging in things that are, evil. There's also this element of conformity. What do we mean by conformity here? What is it to conform with others?
To follow.
Yeah, it's to follow. And another thing that we find in these cases is that very often, if other people around you are doing it, or more importantly, as long as you think everyone else around you is going to do it, you do not want to be the one who stands out. So often what it takes is just, as long as one person does something and you start to believe that everyone else in the group is going to also think that, and if you went against it, you would stand out. That is another way in which ordinary people is, yeah, so there's this element of you ignore your own instincts to appease the group for fear of being ostracized. And so in these sorts of cases, you start to wonder, like, to what degree does this affect our behaviors? And if there's this element in which the majority of people will do something just to fit in, is it really appropriate to start thinking about this in terms of good and evil? Or is it rather more appropriate just to think of, or to think of it like, if you do something just because everyone else around you is doing it, and not only that, the vast majority of people in your circumstances would do exactly as you did, does it really make sense to start thinking about this in terms of punishment? Like, if you were behaving in the same way that 70% of humans would behave in your circumstances, does it really make sense to think about this as an action that you should go to jail for? Or is it just like unfortunate that you were the one who happened to be in this circumstance? Should we really expect people to, because the number of people, if only 33% of people are willing to go against the Milgram experiment, should we really hold the 67% as somehow evil to the core? Should we think of them as evil people? Or do we need to reconsider how we even go about thinking about evil? Do we have to stop thinking about it as internal, or at the very least, reconsider what punishment should be like? Because, well, yeah, Maria.
I feel like this is because it's in a group setting too, it changes it, because I know like the whole point of like the socialization of evil, because I feel like you can, I mean, this is problematic too. You could be like individual people are evil, but like in group settings, you can't really say that they're evil because other factors are at play.
Yeah, so I think there is this thing, which is that in group settings, human behavior changes in a lot of ways, and we start acting in ways that are very different from how we'd act on our own. And the one thing we have to worry about, though, is we have this image of like punishment and like reward and punishment, where this is you. You are human. You do your actions. When you do something, you are operating in a vacuum, or at the very least, you are operating with complete control over your decisions. So if you do something wrong, we can punish you. If you do something right, we reward you. And if you do something wrong and we punish you, it's because you could have done differently, or you should have done differently. But there's this issue where very often we are in these social groups. And once you start taking social groups into consideration, it starts to look like our general view of evil and our views of things like crime and punishment connected with our traditional view of wrong and evil starts to be really problematic, because what we start to see is that the vast majority of people, if you put them in the right circumstances, the right social situation, even if they had a totally normal childhood, even if they have a totally normal family life, will start doing some things that are like, have to be described, if anything can be called evil, are evil. So let's go with Stanford prison experiment as another way. So what we were talking about with the Milgram, what we have is authority figures leading to normal people behaving in evil ways. I mean, Holland, we could, here's the thing. As of right now, this was going to be the only class, but if everyone's like, let's spend more time on this, I'm happy to find more readings and totally rearrange it. But as of right now, this was going to be the only class, but I'm happy to rearrange things if everyone's like, you know what, let's talk more about this stuff. I can find some readings. What are people's thoughts on this? Would people like to spend more time discussing evil and then we can just push other stuff later? I'm seeing a couple nods. Okay, we've got
I enjoy the reading a lot, so.
All right, so yes, here's what's going to do. I have to learn more about meta ethics. More on evil. So, right, so here's what I'm gonna say. The majority of people seem, so here's what I'm gonna do for next class. I'm going to find various other articles on the nature of evil and the nature of evil in our psychology. What I will do is I'll try to find some stuff that's looking more at the like personality side of it. So right now we're taking this very strong like social circumstances. So what I can do is try to find some more stuff on the personality correlates with evil and that sort of thing. And so basically for the reading for next time, I'm just going to email everyone and say, it's going to be a new reading. I'm going to find it tomorrow morning. So you don't have the new reading yet, but I will email everyone out. Don't worry about it right now. But yeah, so we're going to spend more time on evil. I'm going to take a little more time to, yeah, I'll find some more stuff on it and that's what we'll talk about. So, also, let's just, I'm trying to think here. How many people would just like to spend a little more time on ethics stuff in general? So this is the evil stuff. Holland is suggesting more because there's a lot of research on psychology or moral psychology. So what are the moral underpinnings of our or what are the psychological underpinnings of our views of what's right and wrong? Where does it come from? What influences those judgments? If people are interested in this, I can scrap the animal stuff and just look for moral psychology stuff for the next few classes, because really I would much rather talk about stuff that you all find more interesting. And are people on board with this, where if I for the next like just readjust the syllabus? All right, that's what I'll do. I will readjust the syllabus and we'll try to spend basically the remainder of the class on moral psychology. What that means is it's going to take me a couple days to redo the syllabus, but I will redo and find new readings that are more tied around this topic. So expect an email from me on Wednesday, and we're going to readjust the course to focus more, because there's some really cool stuff on moral psychology. Also, there's some really interesting things on the way in which actual physiology associates with moral judgments. And we have all these weird things where a lot of ethical views within philosophy assume this like really high level view of what it is to do something right and wrong. Things like the consequences of it, or are you treating someone with respect? But then there's been all these new experiments that seem to suggest that our judgments about right and wrong are just very closely related to our disgust reaction. And very often, if we find something disgusting, we say it's morally wrong. And what are those implications for what it actually means for something to be right and wrong? So yes, I will find some more readings on that. For now, back to evil, which is, what was I going to say? Oh, Stanford prison experiment. Yeah, so the Stanford prison experiment. This is another famous experiment that would never have, yes, so Alan is bringing up this other one, and this is something I definitely wanted to talk about, is these sorts of experiments really start to some real stress on this notion of the bad apple theory of why bad things happen. We have this idea of why is it that somebody does something wrong? And so very often you see things in the news like, well, why did this particular police officer shoot someone? Why were they extra violent? They were a bad apple. They were somebody bad. When you start to look at all the different things that get combined into it, to these behaviors, what we start to see is that things like evil, it's hard to explain them as a few bad actors or the bad apple making the whole collection of apples go rotten. It rather starts to seem like they're ordinary apples that just so happen to be in a circumstance where any apple is going to rot in that sort of case. So Stanford prison experiment. What is the Stanford prison experiment? Anyone know? Oh, Marie, you had a hand. Sorry, I just saw it.
Sorry, I was just going to add on to what you were saying before. I feel like that also applies to like how people say politicians are evil. It's kind of like a greater systemic thing rather than like individual politicians. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, that's another great one. And I think this is something, this would actually be, I'm just putting up things on here that I want to make sure to look up readings on. So this is kind of for me on this corner. Yeah, personality and evil, systematic evil in society, and the psychology behind that. Why is it that we're so averse to seeing systematic evil, and why people don't like to think of their institutions as evil in so many cases? But yeah, Stanford prison experiment. Anyone want to give it a stab of remember what it was? I'll give you a clue. Yeah, Zimbardo ran an experiment where some students were assigned as guards and others as prisoners. Prisoners were given numbers, and eventually the guards became really abusive. Eventually is a little misleading here. It happened in like 2 days. So basically, yeah, here's how the experiment worked. It was supposed to be a 2-week experiment, and you were paid for this one. The idea was you randomly agreed to basically become an actor in a fake prison. You did nothing wrong, but they tried to make it very realistic. So if you were randomly assigned, you were either a prisoner or you were a prison guard. If you were a prison guard, you were given a uniform and a stick, and you were given like once a day, you had an 8-hour shift you had to show up for to guard the prisoners. If you were a prisoner, it was conducted at Stanford, so the Palo Alto police rolled up to your house, arrested you, took you to the police station for processing, put you in handcuffs, but then instead of taking you to an actual jail, they took you to this fake prison. The fake prison had individual cells. You had a cellmate, you had other people on the block, and basically, the study was designed to find out like what causes prisoners to start behaving in certain ways, what causes guards to start behaving in certain ways. Is it that you have to, oh yeah, the experiment was incredibly elaborate. Anyone who's ever seen an interview with Zimbardo, this guy does not do half measures. He goes all in on this stuff. He seems like a interesting fellow, to say the least. But yeah, so they brought them in, and what ended up happening was within days, the prisoners started behaving with these major, like the sorts of behaviors that you typically think of prisoners as having. So you ended up in circumstances where you had the prisoners who were like behaving very meekly, or were trying to get very like stand up for themselves. And in response, the guards were starting to get physically and verbally very abusive with these prisoners. Now, again, you were getting paid good wages, but there was nothing to stop you from just saying, I'm uninterested, I'm leaving, please take me out of here. All of what you'd lose the paycheck. But despite this, and these were just volunteers, ordinary people, ended up in this prison. It was supposed to go for 2 weeks. It lasted, I think, only about a week before it was deemed too violent. And basically everyone started acting in the very stereotypical way you think of people in these positions acting. Prisoners were ratting each other out for very small things. So like one person was making up stories so the guards would give him more stuff. He was like, my bedmate was, he was talking shit about you. Because I brought this news to you, is there anything you can do for me? The guards were just referring to the prisoners exclusively as like you and hitting them with sticks. They were putting people in solitary confinement. And so the question here is, what the hell, why on earth did these ordinary people start acting in this way? And secondly, what does it mean about the nature of evil? Because these experiments, and one of the most fascinating things is that Zimbardo, oh yeah, the guards were instructed to refer to the prisoners by number, and the prisoners were told to just refer to the guard as like, yes, sir, no, sir. And one of the most interesting things is Zimbardo wasn't ultimately the one who insisted that the experiment get canceled. He had more or less taken, he describes in his own words how he started feeling like the superintendent of this prison, where he started acting almost like a overbearing prison attendant. And it was just like his assistant who was like, look, professor, this shit needs to stop. This is getting really fucked up. And so what does this suggest about evil? What does it mean that ordinary folks in these positions, all that they were told was, you are a guard, your job is to keep order, or you are a prisoner, you're here because you're a prisoner? What does it suggest?
I think there's like a cultural narrative that justifies evil. right? Like with the numbers thing, you're dehumanizing the prisoners. So it ends up justifying evil because they're no longer a person, they're just a prisoner. And there's a sort of role that comes with that. Also, I think with them getting paid, it sort of builds in an excuse. I'm just doing my job. I'm not a quitter. I'm bringing forth order. So there's all these sort of cultural stories we tell ourselves that sort of help justify the evil.
And so those are, you just brought up about 6 different things that I want to address, but let's start here with this. One of the things that the experiment really brought up is that as long as certain conditions are met, you can you can kind of guide ordinary people into this sort of behavior. One of the things that often happens is ordinary people are willing to do evil things as long as they can tell themselves there's a good reason behind it. So even in this case, the case was pay, but they were just telling themselves like, I'm doing this, it's part of the job, I need to do this, this is my role, I'm supposed to be this way. Also, the other thing is people start defining themselves by that role, and there starts to be this sort of role camaraderie. So it's not just like, you know, the guards start viewing themselves as guards who are like their other guards, and therefore as soon as you have roles, there's this need to conform to what those roles are, and pressures not to step outside of those roles. So it's not, and another big thing is something as simple as they were given a uniform. The very act of having a uniform allows you to define yourself in terms of the role. So it's not just, you're no longer an individual, and those are no longer prisoner, that's no longer Joe, that is 24601, and I am now the guard whose job it is to keep justice in order. So human beings, if you can get them to have a story in their own head, and especially things like, I have a family to feed, I need this job, you can get people to do things simply because of those sorts of pressures. Also, the other key is the quickest way to get people to do screwed up things to other people is get them to not think of those other people as people. So what there was another study done, let me pull up the reading. I want to say it was Bandura who was so here was the experiment. It was similar to the Milgram style experiment in which you were told you were going to be shocking people for some experimental purpose. And the way it was is you were told you were going to be shocking students from another school. The experimenter would either just describe them as students, would say they seem nice, or say they seem like animals. That's all the experimenter would say. And what they found was that those words alone significantly changed how much people were willing to shock the other people in the experiment. Granted, again, no shocking actually occurred, but the people doing the shocking didn't know that. So again, just calling someone an animal, like that phrase, that one word, those 3 syllables is enough to change someone's behavior because there's this dehumanizing element. As long as you can tell yourself that the people I'm doing or causing to suffer are not worthy of my concern, you can get people to do lots and lots of things. And this is very often, you know, why it was the case that part of the whole Holocaust narrative was the people being killed were less than fully human. And because of this, it does allow authoritarianism to be contagious. As long as at the top, you have somebody who's willing to dehumanize, somebody who knows these factors, you can get evil to trickle down very quickly. And what is even more troubling is that sometimes nobody in the entire system thinks that what they're doing is evil. They're just playing by the rules and filling the roles they think. So if they think this is how I'm supposed to behave, and you think I don't have to do this, I'm not the one doing this, my boss told me to do it, and I need this job. Other sorts of things that can contribute to this are anonymity. They've done a lot of experiments where basically you put a mask on someone and people are willing to do things that they wouldn't be willing to do without the mask on. The most what's the best example of our willingness to do really screwed up things when we're anonymous? Where can you go in the world, or I guess where, yeah, the internet. Go on Reddit and you'll very quickly discover the power of anonymity. I once, I could do this in person, but I can't do it here. But I one time decided, you know what, let's just see whether this will actually work in class. So I gave half the class the task of write down the worst thing you can say about someone, your least favorite person in the world, the person you hate most, write down your views on them, and then sign your, like, put your name at the bottom. Other half of the class, just tell me your views on this person. Don't write your name on it. And it was way more entertaining than I expected it to be. Like, I was expecting some difference, but the degree to which people were willing to say some truly screwed up stuff. I think one person said they wanted to put thumbnail or thumbtacks under this person's fingernails and like all sorts of truly screwed up things because they felt anonymous. And what all of this is suggesting is, like, if the conditions are right, then it looks like anybody is going to be evil. So what are the consequences of this? What are we supposed to take away if in the right situations, people are evil? Well, I think there's a few different things we could say here, but there's not like right answers. One thing you can say is that inside all of us, we have the potential to be evil people. We are, in the right circumstances, you will find yourself where doing the evil thing is the much easier thing to do. And I don't know whether that just means we should hate ourselves for being evil, or we should think like, does this mean we need to reconsider whether evil is even a thing we should frame things in terms of? Sorry, I'm rambling now. Does anyone have any views of like, what are we supposed to do with all this data? Like, what do we have to reconsider if the world out there isn't like the evil dark side and the good side, but rather ordinary people who just want to have a job and pay the bills and are able to be influenced by social pressures?
Well, I don't think this changes anything because while these are factors, I think there's still free will to be at play here, and that even though you have certain instincts, you can still regulate those instincts and make sure it doesn't come about.
Marie.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I feel like it's like this Hobbesian thing where humans are brutish and like they're kind of just like we're inherently problematic. And like it goes to like that Freudian point where we have like that id part of us. But I do think like we spend our whole lifetimes trying to like not be that way. And that's why people like uptake meditation and stuff like that to try to deviate from that nature.
So to play devil's advocate here, so I for one definitely have the I have the sort of gut feeling like I want to have free will as much as anybody else does. Like it would be kind of scary if it's all just, you know, was determined by the Big Bang. But at the same time, there does seem to be like if the degree of personal moral fortitude necessary to behave well is so high, does it really mean that we get to say like, because we want, as we're talking about in the prison case, we want to be like, well, those people over there, those are the people unlike us, and we are the good ones. But if it takes this level of like moral heroicism to just go against your internal instincts, does this in any way like put it seems like it shines a light in a slightly different way. It also like, it does force you to look in the mirror and be like, I need to make sure that if I'm ever in this situation, I can't be the person who was willing to push a button because I needed to keep my job or X, Y, and Z. If you believe in a moral framework, you can study morality from a social biological standpoint. I have nothing to add, Holland. Yeah, you can definitely, like, morality from a why on earth do we think that there are good and bad and evil? That is itself a question. There's a question of, like, if evil exists, then what is it? Another question is, if evil isn't the way we think of it, then why do we typically go in this direction? Why do we like to put things in terms of good and evil? Why do we want to think that there's a right side and a wrong side? I think it's creature intelligence. We like to believe that we control our actions, thoughts, and emotions 100%. Anything that threatens us makes us feel uncomfortable. It's easy to think, well, I wouldn't do that when you're looking at these circumstances in a situation. And so much history shows us that normal people constantly demonstrate otherwise. And I think that is really one of the takeaways from this. So whatever you think in terms of the right and wrong or the goodness and badness of these sorts of things, one of the things to really take away is there are these elements of doing we think we aren't like those people. And a lot of times our reason for it though is not because we aren't, but rather because it's pretty troubling sometimes to have to look in the mirror and say that might be me. There's also let's just throw up some cognitive dissonance stuff while we're here. What is cognitive dissonance? Which is another thing we can add in, which explains. So yeah, there definitely, and I want to talk more about this, is if there's all these social factors, why is it then that there are things like meditation that are helpful? Because there have been studies that there are brain changes in people who do meditation that is correlated with the part of the brain that is associated with impulse control. So there does seem to be some element of it. Yeah, meditation equals reflection. Next time you're bothered by something, try as hard as you can not to be bothered by it. See how difficult it is to control your thoughts despite thinking that you're ultimate. Yeah, and this is another aspect is like, and this is something we can talk about more with these other things, is just the idea of like, to what degree do we have free will? And to what degree is free will like an illusion of our psychology versus something that we should think really is there? But cognitive dissonance, how many people are familiar with cognitive dissonance? Has anyone from a psychology class? All right, so anyone want to give a definition of it?
We have two competing ideas in our brain, in our head, and it causes us this. I guess I can't explain it that good, but we have two competing ideas in our head and it causes us not to understand either. Or
it's like psychological discomfort, right?
Yeah, it's this level of it's what ends up happening is that it's a level of psychological discomfort that comes when our actions don't line up with our views of ourselves or views of what we should be doing. And what we end up doing in a lot of cases is we rewrite the narrative to convince ourselves of something in a way that, like, from the outside looks really screwed up. So for instance, hazing rituals in fraternities and sororities. Why are there hazing rituals in fraternities and sororities? Why are they there? Well, first off, here's a question. They've done studies. Different fraternities and sororities have different levels of hazing. Some of them are rather mundane. They're things like, you have to wear some ugly clothes on Saturdays for a month, and then, haha, you get to join. Others are some really screwed up things that involve, like, you have to stand in a dark room and be peed upon by strangers. You have to throw up all over yourself and then sleep in it. Like, really screwed up things. Yeah, there was a kid at Baruch who died a few years ago from a hazing incident. There are many, every few years, a hazing incident comes out in which somebody died. Now, they've looked at, so we've got fraternity or sorority A and B. Let's say A, this one, really screwed up stuff. This one, normal, boringly safe hazing. They then look back 20 years later. Which group do you think gives more money to their fraternity? 20 years later, they are now asked, they get an email that says, hey, will you send us some donations? Which group gives more money? The ones who went through the truly screwed up experience or the ones who went through the boring one? My old
screwed up one.
They're really screwed up. Why? Why? This is the correct answer. This is the one that people gave more money to. Why? What is the thinking that goes on in someone's head to explain it? So it's a loyalty to the group. It's trauma bonding, but it's another thing in which the idea is they have to justify their actions. If you went to a hazing ritual where all you had to do was solve a puzzle and wear a t-shirt, then you could just say to yourself, you have a relatively reasonable view on this group. You think back and you go, oh yeah, that is, so yeah, there's two elements. One of it is the bonding that comes with really intense situations. It's a sense of camaraderie of like, we survived hell together. But another element is just by yourself, you have to justify, if I was willing to be pooped on by a stranger, that must have been the best goddamn thing of my life. It must have been so worth it, because I'm not a fucking schmuck. I'm not a schmuck. Only a schmuck would get pooped on by a stranger for no good reason. And I know I'm not a schmuck. Therefore, this group must have been great. And so what we can often find is that there ends up being this self-reflecting thing. So what you'll often find people doing is, if you tell them like you were a part of some terrible organization, they will convince themselves more and more in the greater good. So if you are starting off as someone who like has mild like over time of working in some place like a concentration camp, you will over time have to go to sleep at night. You will convince yourself more and more that you are doing this for the greater good. And over time, you'll become more extreme in your views to justify to yourself the things that you're doing. In the Zimbardo reading, he had a description of this group of, it was, let me see if I can find the name of it. It was basically this special unit of people responsible for killing Jewish civilians behind the lines in World War II. And what they found were, these were not soldiers, they were not trained, they were just ordinary old folks who were too old to join the regular army. They were rounded up, given guns, and early on, very few of them would partake in these murders. But as time went on, they became more extreme. One is they got used to the activities, but also because they became stronger believers in this is for the greater good. Because now that I'm in so far, now that I believe it, I can't go back. I have done these things. I need to convince myself that what I'm doing is right. All right, so going forward, we are not going to have class on Wednesday because it's the second half of the semester and we're all exhausted. Secondly, I'm going to find new readings on all of these things. If you want to meet with me at any point to talk more about any of this stuff, feel free. If there's even a few of you who are like, look, professor, I find this stuff fascinating. I want to keep having additional class times. We'll find a time that works. Like, I am totally cool with that. I just did this for, like, I cut down on class time because last semester people started dying on me. Not literally. But like exhaustion set in, and by the end of the semester, there was no engagement at all. So this time I put that in, but if people want to meet more often than once a week going forward, just let me know and I'm happy to do it. I will find readings on more stuff having to do with evil and about moral psychology, which is just going to be looking at things of why is it that we think of things in terms of good and bad from a psychological perspective, maybe a biological perspective too of what is the benefit of this. So, any questions, comments, concerns, feelings at this point? We good? All right. Okay. In that case, I'm going to stop the recording. If anyone has any questions, wants to stick around. For those of you